Welcome back to the table, friends. I'm your humble host, GreyDMs, and with me as always is Owen.
Hello.
So, if you've been listening to us for a while, you've probably heard us talk about TTRPGs.
Oh, that's what we've been talking about?
Most of the time.
Shit.
But you've also heard us talk a lot about wargaming or referencing wargaming, oftentimes in specific games like Warhammer 40K, stuff like that.
Yeah, I'd really like to play that sometimes.
Someday.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think
I heard it's easy to get into. You know, you don't have to devote a lot of time or money to it. You can just, play.
Well, sir, don't I have boxes full of material to do?
If you've got an extra like 15 or 20 minutes, you can just bang a couple games out.
To those of you that doesn't make sense, why that's funny, this podcast for you. So today we're not
facetious.
We're not going to talk about Warhammer specifically. We're going to talk about wargaming in general, and the distinction is pretty important because often the two get conflated as each other. So wargaming is a fascinating hobby that blends strategy, history, and creativity. It has evolved from military training exercise into popular pastime enjoyed by enthusiasts worldwide. So basically, today we're going to talk about the origins, development, and the impact of wargaming kind of as a hobby on humanity a bit. So, would you be surprised to know that wargaming existed before the previous century?
Yes, because I kind of did a podcast that talked about that.
You did?
Yeah.
So, Owen, if you can dig back into your memory, what do you think the first war game was?
Well, I specifically remember one the Romans had.
Oh, that's good.
I remember there was one that was actually a training exercise performed on a table that the Byzantines did.
Oh,
I'm trying to remember how far back it went.
That might be a good contender for the first one.
Yeah.
As far as my notes, as limited as they are, one of the first examples that comes up, and this does have a pretty good application for the oldest kind of war game, loosely defined war games, was Wei Ha.
Oh,
Wei
okay.
Hai,
No,
which is basically the ancestor to the current popular Chinese originated game Go.
really?
So Go,
I mean, that makes sense because Go is a very strategic game.
It's about taking territory.
Yep.
It's supposed to. So basically, Wei Ha was developed in China and became a key part of the intellectual and strategic training. It spread to Japan and Korea, where it evolved into the modern game of Go. The game was highly regarded by scholars and military leaders as it emphasized territorial control, tactical positioning, and long-term strategic thinking. If you've never seen or heard of the game Go, basically it's played on a grid board, typically 19 by 19, or this is the older version. Players take turns placing little black or white stones on the intersections of the board. And the goal is to control more territory than your opponent by surrounding empty spaces. Stones can be captured if they are completely surrounded by the opponent's pieces. So like I said, the mechanics are relatively simple to teach, but hard to master. And the game ends when both players agree that no further moves will significantly change the board. So there's kind of a more honest,
yeah. I mean, I can see the people sort of like, no, we go until the end.
Yeah. So another game that equally finds its place in kind of ancient origins is called Chaturanga.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is an Indian game from
Very
India.
familiar.
Yep. Which is...
I'm not. I was waiting for you to be like, what? Really?
I was going to let it go. Which is basically an ancient Indian strategy board game that dates back to around the 6th century AD.
Oh, wow.
It is considered the precursor to modern chess.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
Yeah, as well as other regional variants like Shatranji, which is Persian chess, Chinese or Japanese chess, like Shogi is the Japanese version. The ancient name comes from Sanskrit meaning 4 divisions, referring to the 4 branches of the Indian army: the infantry, the cavalry, the elephantry, and chariots. The game was played on a flat 8x8 board called Ashtapada, which was used for other traditional Indian games. So basically 2 players each controlled an opposing army containing of 4 typical pieces. Infantry, which were pawns, cavalry, which were knights, elephantry, which were bishops, and chariots, which were rooks.
That lines up.
The king was the most important piece, and in this game, the game was won by capturing the opponent's king instead of threatening it. The minister, which was the precursor to the queen, had limited movement, likely moving 1 square diagonally. Elephant's movement is uncertain, but there's some theories that suggest it moved 2 squares diagonally. Pawns could promote upon reaching the last rank, but historians debate whether or not they could become any piece other than a minister. And the game likely did not include castling, and stalemates may have resulted in a win for the attacking player. But, so that's all cute and all, but like, what are we talking about? Like actual kind of when we think of wargaming.
Yeah.
And the birth of modern wargaming. And this is something that we've talked about probably many times.
Yeah. If it doesn't have tiny figurines that I got to paint, not interested.
Yeah. So the first formal war games appeared in the late 18th century in 1780. Johann Christian Ludwig Hellwig developed a game that used a grid-based system to simulate battles. Later, in 1811, Baron von Reiswitz developed a game that introduced a sand table war game, which was refined by his son in 1924 into Kriegspiel, a game used by the Persian military for officer training. The Prussian military, not the Persian military, sorry. Hellwig developed one of the earliest war games in 1980 known as a Kriegspiel style game, because Kriegspiel just means war game in German. His goal was to create a chess-like game that better reflected military strategy, incorporating elements such as infantry, cavalry, and artillery. Hellwig was a mathematics professor in Braunschweig, Germany, and taught military science. His game was designed to train officers and simulate battlefield tactics. The game was played on a grid-based board similar to chess, but with color-coded squares representing different types of terrain.
Oh,
so here
that's where it comes from.
Yeah, so we changed the kind of like all terrain moves the same kind of thing.
Do you think they argued like that's full cover? No, that's only partial cover.
Is that green, or is that like puce, or what is it?
Puce. Puce is also green.
It became commercially successful and inspired later war games, including the Prussian military training simulations. So as far as we can figure out, the game was played on a large grid, unlike chess, which had a fixed board size. So this was like, a table, the whole table could be the grid. Different units, infantry, cavalry, and artillery had unique movement rules reflecting real battlefield conditions. Terrain affected movement and combat, making strategy more complex than traditional chess.
And so did GW just read their rule book and say, we're stealing this?
Oh, GW stole a lot, but we'll get to that eventually. The game was designed for 2 or more players, allowing for multi-person tactical engagements. Hellwig's war game laid the foundation for modern military simulations and really the whole hobby of wargaming. So later, Kriegspiel, which, like we said, meant war game in German, was developed by the Prussian army in the 19th century as a military training tool. It was the first wargaming system formally adopted by a military organization to teach battlefield tactics.
So do you think every 3 years they released a new edition? We have to update the whole army.
Guys, we got to push out of the battle sheet updates for Kriegspiel 3.27. Like, dude, my whole okay, that's it. We got to half you cadets have to leave. Okay, you're not the meta anymore.
Well, I'm just imagining World War I like that, where it's just like, all right, send the cavalry. Oh man, you didn't read the update? Cavalry's completely outdated now.
They're pushing out tanks? There's a whole class called tanks. I don't know what this is.
They got these things called machine gunners. What do those do? They kill cavalry.
This is this update is bullcrap.
So we still line up in a straight line and just shoot at each other, right? No, that got taken out of the rules. They got taken out of the rules and they added this stratagem called mustard gas.
It's don't you don't want to use that. You're gonna get kicked out of the player if you. So before Kriegspiel, early war games were more chess-like, basically. So Reiswitz Senior's prototype, which was in 1812, was developed basically a sand table war game where players moved wooden blocks over sculpted terrain. So that might be the thing you were thinking of.
Mm-hmm.
But his son refined the game into a map-based system with precise measurements for troop movement and combat. This version was officially adopted by the Prussian military.
Yeah, that makes more sense.
So after Prussia's victory in the Franco-Prussian War from 1870 to 71, other nations, including the U.S., adopted similar war games for military training.
Or they made a movie about that.
Oh,
called War Games.
That's what that movie's about.
Yes.
Go watch it. That movie is literally about painting little miniatures.
Yes, it is.
And America's adaptation of using the Prussian military war game.
Yes. If that's not what's on the screen while you're watching it, you got the wrong version.
Get in the comments.
In the comments.
So Kriegspiel is played on a map representing a battlefield, with blocks representing military units. The game is moderated by an umpire who interprets orders and determines combat outcomes.
Out.
Yeah, this is the thing we talked about before. We're like very glad they moved on from like umpire and referee as
Yeah, but I mean, at the same time, you sometimes when you play a war game, you kind of wish there was an umpire just to say like, yes, that's what happened. No, you can't do that.
But no one's giving that guy money.
No,
booze to make sure. Yeah, check this.
You give them booze, they're just going to get drunk.
That's true.
Can't do that.
So movement was based on real-world distances, calculated using rulers and measurements.
Mm-hmm.
Combat resolution was determined by either mathematical calculations or the umpire's judgment.
I cross those mountains. No, I'm sorry.
like can't I? Like clearly, I have 3 chariot groups. I can take down this 1 infantry group.
Now, if you're using a group of elephantary to cross the mountains, I would say it's okay.
I've never heard of that in history. It's not
That's never happened.
So the key thing about this game was basically that hidden information was like the key figure.
Mm-hmm.
The players did not see the entire battlefield.
Fog of War.
So they introduced Fog of War.
How did they do that?
Yeah. So, which I think we get into the next one.
Okay.
So the next one has a little more information over. So Strategos.
Mm-hmm.
Does that sound familiar?
Sounds like Stratego.
Yep. So Strategos was a military war game developed by Charles A.I. Totten for the United States Army and published in 1880. It was designed as a training tool for officers, helping them develop strategic thinking and battlefield tactics. The game was heavily influenced by the Prussian Kriegspiel, which had been widely adopted for military training in Europe. But of course, we Americans are like, hey, let's do it better.
If not better, at least louder.
Yeah, at least louder. Strategos was unique because it aimed to be accessible to both new and experienced players, offering introductory scenarios that gradually increased in complexity. Unlike traditional Kriegspiel, which was often observed for elite military leadership, Strategos was meant to be widely used within the U.S. Army. That's kind of one of the good things that the U.S. did. This is there's a whole thing about bragging, but like one of the things that we kind of do have good in our history is like a large portion of our history was spent going like, oh, in Europe, that's meant for the rich people. Screw it, give it to everybody. If we stick to that, we'll do better.
Yeah.
So Strategos consists of 2 different games. The battle game, which was played on a board resembling chess but incorporating military formations, and the advanced game, which was played on maps and miniature terrain with a referee overseeing the game. The battle game was more structured and owes its heritage to Johann Christian Ludwig Hellwig's war game.
Why such a long name?
Players controlled military units represented by pieces on a board. Movement and combat are determined by predefined rules similar to chess. But the advanced game was scenario-based with players divided into red and blue teams. Orders are given in writing, and each side has its own topographic map. Hence the Fog of War.
So they have to like roll dice at the beginning. It's like, oh, looks like we're doing Dawn of War again.
Right? A referee oversees the game, ensuring fairness and realism. Blocks represented troop formations, scaled to match real-world military units. Dice and probability tables are used to resolve conflicts, with players rolling dice openly to determine open combat outcomes. Strategos was an important step for the evolution of military wargaming influenced later system used by the U.S. Army. So, and we go into the 20th century, right? So during the 20th century, wargaming expanded beyond military applications. The British Army adopted wargames for strategic planning, and the U.S. military used them extensively during World War II. Meanwhile, civilian interest grew, leading to the development of commercial wargames. The British Army has used wargaming as a strategic planning tool for decades, incorporating various methods to simulate battlefield scenarios and decision-making process. The UK Ministry of Defence has published a wargaming handbook that outlines how wargaming is applied at different levels of military planning, including national, strategic, operational, and tactical levels.
You know, if we ever get rich, I want to get one of those handbooks, and then we can buy actual tanks
It's just
and stuff, and like
I want
some property somewhere.
I want fun cosplayers to dress up as space wolves. And I'm going to get a bunch of children to be Imperial Guard, like cultists, and we're going to have a match.
Is that a Sherman? No, this is a Lehman Russ.
Repulsor Executioner. It's Lehman Russ, yeah. The U.S. military has used various war games over the years to teach strategy, refine tactics, and prepare officers for real-world conflicts. These war games range from tabletop exercises to computer simulations and even live-action drills. So, the U.S. military has used Kriegspiel, Strategos, as we said, Dunkempf, which was a widely used manual war game that simulated combined arms warfare against a Soviet-led Warsaw Pact. Computer-based simulations, such as SimNet, JCATS, and 1SAF, which are all things I wish to Google when I go home. Red teaming and decision-making exercises, and of course, live wargaming exercises. Most of them focus on either like scenario-based planning, fog of war simulation, outcome analysis, and basically promote the whole concept of a safe-to-fail environment where basically you can kind of learn strategy without the add a knife point kind of, you know. The U.S. Army's War College and other institutions continue to refine educational wargaming to sharpen tactical and strategic thinking. So, if not the Army, then who would take on the championship of like wargaming, right? The
nerds.
Nerds. So the 1950s and 1960s saw the emergence of wargaming as a recreational activity. Charles S. Roberts founded Avon Hill, a company that produced board games like Tactics and Gettysburg. These games introduced hexagonal grids and detailed combat mechanics at the stage for modern wargaming. My God, I remember there's a Nintendo version of Gettysburg.
Yeah.
And like my cousin came in, and for whatever reason, that was the only game we played. And he was from the north. I was from the south.
So which side did you play, Gray?
I don't want to talk about that.
Were you proud you picked that side?
All I'm going to say is I won.
Well, thank God fiction doesn't reflect reality.
No. So Avon Hill was founded in 1952, as I said, by Charles S. Roberts as the Avalon Game Company, later renamed Avalon Hill in 1958. It was the first company to commercially produce board war games, pioneering the genre and setting the foundation for modern strategy gaming. So in their early years, they introduced Tactics in 1954, the first modern board war game, followed by Gettysburg in 1958, which was basically the first game to simulate a historic battle.
You think about how good they had it, because like you think about the names of board games now and everybody has to come up with something like crazy because everything's been used so far. And that guy's just like, Tactics. A game that teaches you tactics. My second game, A Horrible War. Gettysburg.
Roll to write letters to the families of the people that have died.
My dearest Martha, times have grown difficult indeed. Food is sparse, but my thought of your beautiful face. Yeah, that's as far as I can go.
I was surprised you went that far. So, expansion from the 1970s to the 1980s, the company released Panzer Blitz, 1970, a groundbreaking tactical war game, and one of the greatest games of all time, Diplomacy, a classic negotiation-based strategy game. If you ever want to hear about how bad diplomacy will wreck a workplace, there's a really good video by Matt Koval that talks about how people start like threatening to shake people over lunch. Like, it's like,
hey, let's play this fun little game. I hate everyone I work with.
Oh, it's so good because the rules are so like few and simplistic, everything is actual diplomacy, and it's all based on actual lying and do you believe in the pact that you signed?
Yeah.
It's really good. So finally, Acquisition and Legacy, which is from 1998 to the present. Avalon Hill was acquired by Hasbro in 1998, and its games continue to be published under the Hasbro gaming division. So, fortunately, yeah. However,
I mean, it can't be that bad.
Most of the games basically don't exist, or they're just reprints now. However, they introduced a couple concepts that, largely they're credited for introducing into our hobby. One of them is hexagonal grids. Another one's zones of control, stacking mechanics for unit organization, and the big one was they were the ones who basically were putting historical accuracy out, kind of like as one of their big draws for their games. Let's talk about tactics a little bit.
Yeah, let's talk about tactics.
So Tactics was, of course, designed by Charles S. Roberts in 1954, and it was basically the first commercially successful board game. It did use hexagonal grids, unit counters, and combat resolution system. So Roberts basically designed Tactics from his home in Cantonsville, Maryland, aiming to create a self-contained war game with a map, counters, and rules. So initially, it was sold via mail order.
Yeah, that's something I always think about when I was a kid, because internet wasn't around and catalogs and stuff like that. And it was always just just mail us a check with your address and everything, and we'll send you this thing.
So when my buddy got really big into Mystery Science Theater 3000, he could watch it because he had cable.
Yeah.
I didn't.
Yeah.
So I could only watch it on some obscure time period. But the thing was, they had a write-in thing where you could request their catalog and to be added to their fan group.
Oh.
And then they would send you out a thing with all the things you could buy. And I don't know if you remember, it's gone now, but in every previous vehicle, I had that sticker, that window decal of the MST3K thing.
Yeah, that was one of them.
That was from them. It was a mail order decal that basically stuck around for 20 some odd years. Man, I remember one summer, my parents got me this book, and it was basically a book of postcards, and it was 100 different free things you could get by sending in a postcard to the right company.
Oh.
And I blitzed it. I went through and I did at least the first half of them.
Yeah.
And then that entire summer and the following year, random crap
just showed up
for me. And a lot of it was here's a promotional packet of some laundry detergent or something.
I like to think that some of it got lost in the mail, and some of the people that bought that house years later are just what is this stuff? Why does it keep showing up?
Honestly, the greatest thing was one day this box came and it was from Kellogg's.
Yeah.
And I was like, what the heck is this? And they're like, oh, hey, you sent in this very specific request for this very specific thing. And we're telling you, we ran out of them. So instead, we went through our whole cereal lineup and we put one of every single, toy that's in for this year in a box and just gave it to you. And I was like, I hit the freaking jackpot. I had the little squid thing you threw against the wall. And
God, I forgot.
It was just
those.
all of that crap was in one box. It was so cool.
Companies would never do that.
No, it's that. Yeah, that period of time is long time.
It's what? Be nice to the people that consume our product and actually enjoy it? No. We'd rather squeeze every penny out of them.
So moving through time, let's get up to the 70s. So miniature wargaming, very popular in the 1970s with games like Warhammer and Dungeons and Dragons.
So what's that game like?
So here's the shift. So let's back up a little bit. Let's talk about chainmail.
Yes.
Because we've talked
about it.
Yeah, we've mentioned it many times. Yep. Well, it's actually... So chainmail was developed by Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin and first published in 1971 by Gideon Gaiden Games. It was originally designed as a medieval miniatures war game, but it became famous for its fantasy supplement, which introduced elements like wizard, heroes, and mythical creatures. The supplement was heavily influenced by the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, Robert E. Howard, and Paul Anderson. So the game evolved from earlier medieval war games, particularly Siege of Bodenberg, 1967, which Gygax encountered at Gen Con 1.
That's so crazy.
1968.
I didn't even realize it's been going on that long. Wow.
Well, because it was, yeah. Porin had developed his own medieval rules based on Bodenberg, and Gygax expanded them into what became Chainmail. The first edition included rules for mass combat, man-to-man skirmishes, and jousting, which made it a versatile system. So, really, like, all of modern role-playing kind of boils down to this part of, like, people looking at wargaming, which had often been very tied to historical fights, because it's very hard to basically pitch, like, we're living in a world back then where, like, you had to basically pitch the idea of a game to somebody. And so you can pitch them like, oh yeah, did you like World War II? You like that concept of like, oh, you want to be the Allies storming the beaches of Normandy? Well, here, you put a bunch of miniatures together and you reenact that. Versus like telling them like, no, in the grim dark future, there is only, you know, like the pitch to get a person into something, like you need references and pop culture to drive them in. And basically this group of people were like, we want that skirmish level military fantasy thing. Like, I want to talk about, like, you know, Legolas and Aragorn taking on, you know, Uruk-hai, and, you know, like, how can we do that? Right? And they did. And they came up with those rules, and then people started looking at them, and this history as we talked of role-playing games, and a lot of people are like, but what if it was just one dude? Could I just be Aragorn? Could I name him Narragorn? He's my guy. So Chainmail was one of the first commercially successful medieval war games, and it actually helped popularize miniature-based strategy gaming in total. I also introduced a couple mechanics. One of them was troop classification. So now instead of like a block, which was infantry, they were talking about like, well, this is like the light-footed, heavy-footed, cavalry, etc. Dice-based combat resolution for fantasy stuff, and terrain effects on movement and battle outcomes. Like all that kind of came from the skirmish, you know, place. It always existed in very specific quantities, but now it was like coming back to the forefront in like, you know, not some like risk style game where it's just like roll a dice. So although later war games refined these mechanics, Chainmail remains a historically significant, basically, addition to the whole franchise. And once again, that weird point where the two different subject matters of this podcast kind of intersect. Also, Chainmail's fantasy supplement directly influenced the creation of Dungeons & Dragons and developed some of these RPG mechanics which are used today for armor class. That was the first creation of armor class. Saving throws. And basically the casting of magic spells.
I mean, you have to have that if it's going to be fantasy.
Yeah. Early editions of D&D basically even referenced Chainmail for combat resolution before developing their own system. They just like use those rules.
Just go buy this other book, read it, use those rules.
So, 1983. What can we be talking about? Warhammer Fantasy Battles was first published. Games Workshop. It was created by Brian Ansell, Richard Hallowell, and Rick Priestley. It was designed as a tabletop miniature war game set in a medieval fantasy world, incorporating elements of magic, mythical creatures, and large-scale battles. So, as we've talked about before, Games Workshop at the time was basically selling like things for role-playing, miniatures, co-opting different systems, and they got together and they said, hey, why don't we build our own system? And once again, that weird like wargaming diverged into RPGs, which diverged back into wargaming. So originally conceived as a mass combat fantasy role-playing game, Warhammer was influenced by historical war games and, of course, Dungeons & Dragons, the new hit child. The game evolved through multiple editions, refining its mechanics and expanding its lore. It had a pretty good run until 2010. The 8th edition was released in 2010, marking the last version before the game was discontinued.
Wah, wah. Well, that's probably the last we'll ever hear of that company.
Yeah, of course. They're not going to do it. You remember, like, flipping through articles for, like, looking for your army stuff in 40K and then seeing that weird square base.
Yep, the square bases, yep.
It just looked so old then.
Mhm.
And if you didn't grow up with the charm of it, there's always this weird thing where you're like, there's part of me that's like, it's kind of,
It's interesting.
yeah. So unfortunately in 2010, it was discontinued, and the end of Wargaming Fantasy was 2015, where Games Workshop officially replaced Wargaming Fantasy Battles with Warhammer Age of Sigmar, shifting a new setting and rule set. And if you were listening last week, this would be another one of those edition war things.
Yep.
Because Age of Sigmar did not go over well in its first edition. Now, it is beloved by many people.
Mm-hmm.
Arguably, it has made strides to be probably even a superior war game in certain ways.
Oh, man, you just pissed some people off.
Nah, not really. Most people are like, yeah, it's had 3 editions. It's pretty good. But there is so much of a love for the goofy old, that the revival in 2024, Warhammer Fantasy returned as Warhammer the Old World, bringing back classic mechanics and updated models. And the real controversy, if you don't know, is not necessarily just the killing off of the game, but they did it in the lore too. They wrote just kind of like White Wolf did, where they wrote a rushed.
Yeah, this is how everything ended.
And then they introduced the new setting. And some of it's not good. So, what is Warhammer Fantasy Battles? Well, it was a miniature-based system, so basically each player was controlling armies of fantasy creatures on a model battlefield. Players use hand-painted models representing warriors, monsters, or even war machines. Basically, outcomes are, resolved via dice. The game featured diverse factions, including the Empire, Bretonnia, High Elves, Dark Elves, Orcs and Goblins, Skaven, and Chaos. Weird thing for the people who haven't grown up with it. Who do you think the Empire was based off of, and who do you think Bretonnia was based off of?
The exact opposite of what they actually are named for.
Kind of, yeah. The Empire is based off basically the British Isles, and Bretonnia is based off the French.
Yep.
I just don't understand that. But it's because the origins of Arthur is...
Right.
You think of it as England, but it's not. It's actually French. Go figure. Weird French. So, as far as its legacy, Warhammer Fantasy Battles had a massive impact on both wargaming and fantasy storytelling. It popularized miniature wargaming, inspiring games like Kings of War and War Machine. It expanded into video games. The Warhammer universe led to video game adaptations, including Total War Warhammer and Warhammer Online. Total War Warhammer has almost more of a cult following than Age of Sigmar, which is kind of the reason why Warhammer came back.
Yeah.
Because people got into that game hardcore. They want that world, and that world is specific. Back to role-playing games, the setting influenced Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, a tabletop RPG that expanded the lore. Culturally, Warhammer's dark fantasy aesthetic shaped modern fantasy storytelling, influenced books, movies, and games. So yeah, there's a lot of weird influences that game had that we don't recognize.
Yeah.
Because you wouldn't have World of Warcraft and its hero oversized aesthetic if Warhammer Fantasy Battles didn't exist.
Yep.
And that's just this weird cyclical relationship that continues to go on. So obviously Games Workshop had a hit and they never made anything that was more popular.
No, never.
No. But I guess some years later they kind of messed around, and in 1987 Games Workshop created Warhammer 40K.
What?
So it was created by Rick Priestley as a science fiction adaptation of Warhammer Fantasy Battles. The game introduced a grimdark universe blending elements of military strategy, gothic horror, and dystopian themes. So in the early development, it was basically inspired directly by Warhammer Fantasy. Priestley envisioned a futuristic setting with space marines, alien races, and a decaying empire. The first edition, Rogue Trader, in 1987, was the original game and was narrative-driven, allowing players to create their own scenarios. So it's kind of like Chainmail, where you kind of pick your own group of people led often by a rogue trader.
Yep.
Throw a couple space marines in there, a couple orcs as grudging allies, maybe all this is like a heresy today. This would never happen.
happen.
But really in 1993, the modern 40K was birthed with 2nd edition, which introduced the concept of like a structured army list, refined the mechanics heavily, and really started saying like, okay, no, here is the grim, dark aesthetic going forward. 3rd edition in 1998. 1998 was 3rd edition.
Wow.
Streamlined the rules for larger battles. And I believe that's where like the point bloat kind of started happening. Mm-hmm. And then ultimately later editions from 2000s to present, each edition refined gameplay, expanding factions and lore. So kind of like after 3rd edition, you have a run from basically 3rd edition up to 7th edition. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of I'm sure people have opinions, but that's kind of like a gradual progression where they're like going back and like building out factions and kind of stuff. And then after 7th edition, they really did an overhaul because there was like the kind of dark time when GW wasn't making all the money in the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then 8th edition was their like, come back to us. We have bigger Marines.
We made them bigger. Come on. We gave them an extra wound.
And then apparently they like spent the next 3 years praying to the medieval dark gods that a plague would lock everybody in their homes. And the 9th edition came out during COVID.
Yeah.
And because of that, it was just like everybody was stuck at home. People were watching Astartes and they were like, what is this? Now we have what we have.
And the whole time Matt Ward was just getting fat on power.
This is more older editions, but yeah. I know. So 40K evolved into a massive franchise, including tabletop gaming, novels, video games, and pop culture. The game developed a deep narrative, focusing on factions like the Imperium Ban, Chaos, Eldar, Orcs, and Tyranids. Obviously, players built and painted detailed miniatures, engaging in strategic battles, or not that strategic if you're like World Eaters.
Or you roll 1 dice and the game ends.
Basically, for video games, titles like Dawn of War and Total War Warhammer, that is not right. Dawn of War brought the universe to digital platforms. Total War Warhammer was the fantasy.
Yes.
And then even comics. The Black Library published extensive war books, and Marvel, I think.
Did they?
I think Marvel got a hold of, because Marvel has like a whole Marnius Gallagher series that talks about how Marnius Gallagher is not Marnius Gallagher.
Oh, okay.
But like, anyway, and everybody gets ticked off because like he punches a Lord of Skull's head off. Like, cause it's like anyway.
It's a meme.
It's a thing. Anyway, so as far as the legacy, not that it's not ongoing, 40K popularized the grim, dark aesthetic. Basically, its themes of dark dystopian future shape modern sci-fi storytelling.
Basically, they coined the term and then it got worse.
It like directly inspired franchises like StarCraft, Halo, and Mass Effect. The game also fostered a dedicated fan base with global tournaments and hobbyist communities. I mean, it's weird to think that this whole thing based on a British gaming company, like you can walk into a shop in Tokyo and pull a little blister pack of like a Marine and go home and paint it, and people will know what it is.
Yeah,
like it's so bizarre. But for a time, and this probably deserves its own podcast, the rise and fall of there was a rival appeared to 40K. Out of the gloom came the steampunk-clad fist of War Machine, and for a while, like 40K's future was not locked down. War Machine was first released in 2003 by Privateer Press, and it was designed as a steampunk-inspired miniature war game featuring warcasters, warjacks, and infantry units. The game was unique because it focused on powerful warcasters who would channel magical energies into and control these massive mechanized warjacks. War Machine quickly gained popularity due to its competitive playstyle, tight rule mechanics, and dynamic combat system. Essentially everything 40K tries to be today.
Yeah.
The game expanded with multiple factions, including the Signar, the Khador, Krix, and the Protectorate of Menoth, each with distinct playstyles. So by the late 2000s, War Machine had become a major competitor to Games Workshop's 40K. It was praised for balanced gameplay with frequent updates, strong organized play support including tournaments, and innovative mechanics such as a focus system for warcasting. The release of War Machine Mark II in 2010 solidified its place as a top-tier war game with a growing player base and expanded lore.
Man, it sounds like they're just doing great.
Yeah. It was crazy because there was a period of time, like if you if you kind of get into miniatures and stuff where like people start interviewing people who have run miniature shops, and they're like, Privateer Press came in and just started taking the wall over.
Yep.
And it was like month after month, people were coming in and they're like, hey, Space Marines, whatever. They're like, I want to get that Warjack, that cool, like, and like, you're only also painting like 18 models.
Yeah. There's a big difference there where it's like my whole army only took me like a week to paint versus I've been working on this for 6 months.
Yeah. I remember when I bought that dual pack and like spray painted it white and we played it.
Yep.
So despite its success, War Machine faced some challenges. For starters, the rise of other war games, including Infinity and Star Wars Legion, led to increased competition. And like War Machine was trying to usurp 40K.
Yeah.
So it already was fighting, like the two big lions were fighting.
The crabs started coming up.
Yeah.
Yep.
So rules complexity. Later editions became more intricate, making it harder for new players to enter the hobby. One of the things they did was they invented a new game mode called Hordes. And that was like, hey, put more minis.
Gotcha.
Now you're competing with stuff that like you're gonna just lose more market share because you're fighting another battle on the front.
Yep.
Privateer Press struggled. The company faced production delays and distribution issues, leading to a decline in player engagement. By the time War Machine Mark IV 2022 was announced, the game had lost much of its former dominance. However, War Machine is now experiencing a revival. Thanks to new management and strategic changes, Steamforged Games has taken over publishing, introduced modernized mechanics, and digital integrations. The latest roadmap includes Cyrax, Necrofactorium, Khador Annihilators, and Signar Stormforge as far as new additions and expansions. The game now features Prime and Legacy Army units, making it more accessible to both new and veteran players. So War Machine is once again gaining attraction with organized play events and new model releases, bringing players back into the battlefield. Fortunately, it is like a contender out of many.
Yeah.
And they're all fighting for number 2 spot. Well, actually, I take it back. They're fighting for the number 3rd spot because the top 2 are 40K and Age of Sigmar.
Yep.
So with that, let's look at the current state of tabletop wargaming.
Okay, let's hear it.
So tabletop wargaming remains a thriving and evolving hobby with new games, mechanics, and subgenres emerging regularly. While classic franchises like 40K and Flames of War continue to dominate, independent publishers and crowd-funded projects are reshaping the landscape. So, if you're talking about wargaming, what games might you play? Well, obviously at the top, Warhammer 40K is almost always one of the most popular. Age of Sigmar or Warhammer the Old World are usually following up number 2. Infinity, a sci-fi skirmish game with reaction-based mechanics. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Star Wars Legion kind of took a stab a couple years ago out there, which was a Star Wars themed war game focused on ground battles. That's still kind of growing strong, but like it's got a heavy brand. You got to buy in.
Yeah.
So if you don't like Star Wars, you're not going to get into it. Bolt Action.
Never bless this house.
Bolt Action, a historical World War II war game with realistic mechanics, which I'll talk about. Battletech, which no doubt in the future we'll talk about. We have a little bit in the past. Flames of War, which is another World War II miniature game. Marvel Crisis Protocol, which is technically part of the skirmish game. That one's kind of cool because you can effectively put together your like unit of heroes and villains, and they have mechanics for like destroying terrain and throwing people through terrain.
That's cool.
War Machine is still, struggling. And of course, Conquest, the Last Argument of Kings is basically a contender in the rank and file fantasy wargame genre. They basically stepped in when fantasy battles left and were like, we're going to try to take that market share back. So miniature war games are a major segment within the tabletop industry, contributing to $5.3 billion of the market projected by 2035. Crowdfunding platforms like Kickstarter have fueled the growth of independent war games, expanding the market diversity. Digital integration and augmented reality are expected to enhance gameplay experiences, attracting new players. So within this vast landscape, you might get confused by some of the subgenres. So we have a couple of them here, and this is by all not the definitive,
It's the definitive list? Okay, let's hear it.
Yes, come at me. So obviously there's miniature wargaming, which are kind of traditional model-based games like Warhammer or Flames of War. There's skirmish war games, which are kind of small-scale battles with fewer units. This is where like Infinity or Kill Team are really prime, examples. Historical wargaming, which is focused on like real world conflicts, which is like Bolt Action or Black Powder. Fantasy war games, which is kind of magic and mythical creatures, the old world Kings of War. Sci-fi war games, which is more 40K Battletech. Narrative war games, which is very story-driven campaigns. So Legion or Frostgrave. So they're like a overarching story dictates the battles that get fought. And then like hybrid RPG war games, which is very kind of close to narrative games, which is where they blend both elements. And this is kind of like Mordheim or Necromunda.
Yeah, I was going to say like Mordheim. Yeah.
Yeah, those are pretty good examples of those. So I guess to round out, we'll talk about a few current games that we don't talk about that much.
Sure. Let's hear it.
So Infinity.
Yes.
Yeah. So Infinity is a sci-fi skirmish war game developed by Corvus Belli, a Spanish company, and first released in 2005. The game was designed to offer dynamic tactical gameplay with a strong emphasis on reaction mechanics and cover-based combat. So the creators, inspired by cyberpunk and anime aesthetics, wanted a game that felt fast-paced and cinematic.
We want all the edgelords.
Yes. Like one whole faction is just street samurai in armor. Development. Infinity evolved through multiple editions, refining its mechanics, expanding its deep lore. The latest version, Infinity N4, streamlines gameplay while maintaining its complex and tactical depth, which is basically released in 2020. So the game is played on a board. Players are on a 48-inch by 48-inch battlefield with dense terrain. Players use miniatures representing futuristic soldiers and operatives. Players spend orders to activate units allowing movement and attacks. And automatic reaction orders, unlike traditional turn-based games, Infinity allows reaction moves, meaning units can fire back or dodge an opponent's turn. Dice rolls, they use 20-sided dice for combat resolution. And obviously, terrain plays a critical role, affecting visibility and defense. So basically, Infinity is basically known for deep strategy, cinematic action, and immersive, like heavy sci-fi cyberpunk aesthetic.
Yeah.
Star Wars Shatterpoint. Star Wars Shatterpoint is a miniature skirmish game developed by Atomic Mass Games and published under Asmodee. It was officially released June 2nd, 2023.
Relatively new.
The game was designed to bring cinematic Star Wars battles to the tabletop, focusing on small-scale, character-driven combat rather than large armies. Most of the time, you're going to play like 4 people, sometimes 5, because like if you want to play like 2 stormtroopers instead of a named stormtrooper.
Yeah, I've noticed when we go into some game stores and stuff, I've seen some of the squads, and like they'll have like the Andor squad and stuff like that. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, Shatterpoint really it was a really good pitch. I think it might have been a little too board gamey.
Yeah.
However, we bought a bunch of the stuff and haven't played it, so we really got to give it its full due before we know. So it was obviously inspired by Star Wars duels and squad-based combat. Shatterpoint was created to emphasize dynamic movement and tactical decision-making. The game launched with a core set featuring Clone Wars and Galactic Civil War characters. Atomic Mass Games continued to expand Shatterpoint with new squad packs, introducing characters from across the Star Wars universe. Basically, if you're interested, it's a fast-paced skirmish game where players control strike teams composed of iconic Star Wars characters. Each team consists of a squad leader, a second-in-command, and troopers. Players compete to control key points on the battlefield. The game features reaction mechanics, allowing characters to counter enemy movements. Battles are designed to feel fluid and dramatic, capturing the essence of Star Wars. It's gained a pretty heavy popularity when it first came out. There is a very fun, the win mechanic is like this tug of war. And so the score basically moves on a track. So technically it could keep going on for a while, but the whole idea is you're trying to build up enough momentum to move it far enough to win.
Gotcha.
And then when you calculate your points, it moves back towards you.
I see.
So it feels always like you're constantly struggling with basically the state of play, and you're usually fighting over 3 objectives. So here's another one you're going to hear a lot, which is Bolt Action.
Okay, I've heard of Bolt Action.
So Bolt Action is a World War II miniature game developed by Alessio Cavator and Rick Priestley and published by Wargames in 2012. Warlord Games. The game was designed to provide a fast-paced yet tactically deep experience, allowing players to command historical armies in skirmish-level battles. Inspired by historical wargaming, Bolt Action was created to offer a balance and accessibility system for World War II enthusiasts. The game was refined with detailed army lists, campaign books, and historical scenarios. Improved mechanics and balance cemented Bolt Action as a leading historical war game when they came out with the second edition in 2016. So, it's been expanded to include United States, Soviet Union, the British Commonwealth, the German Wehrmacht, Imperial Japan, and smaller nations like France, Finland, and China. There are several campaign books that cover iconic battles such as D-Day, Stalingrad, and the Battle of the Bulge. There have been spin-offs, which include Conflict 47, which is not a historical war game anymore.
No.
But is a diesel punk alternative history version.
Which I would like to play as well.
Yeah, another good one to add to the list. It's been a major influence on a lot of war games. It blends realistic mechanics with engaging gameplay. So they instead of being purely historical, they refined a good system. Bolt Action has a strong global player base with organized events and competitions. And basically, its order dice system has inspired mechanics for other war games. It's basically kind of a cornerstone of the historical miniature wargaming community, offering immersive World War II battles for both casual and competitive play. So, yeah, those are some war games that we talked about.
Yeah.
So
there's so many.
Yeah, I mean, wargaming is something that is also it's kind of weird because you imagine that if two people like us are having a conversation in 30 years,
yeah,
they may be talking about turning points happening within the hobby right now.
Mm-hmm.
So
does it need to even be 30 years? It could probably be 5 to 6.
True. When we got into 40K, it was a vastly different game system than it is today.
Yes.
And even today, if you like the IP property of 40K, you may not even play the game. You may play 40K. You may try to play something like Combat Patrol, which is very directly tied to it.
Mm-hmm.
You may stray and play Kill Team.
Yeah. And
you're playing a skirmish game with 10 figures. You may want narrative and play Necromunda and play a campaign story-based long-term, I'm keeping track of what happens to these characters over the course of a year or more.
Mm-hmm.
There's all these different ways to engage, and some of them gain popularity very quickly and then die off.
Yep.
Some of them fight for contention over what should be wargaming. It's a dynamic and changing, and then new games appear. There are now technically these games that are single player war games.
Okay.
And you'd have to classify it because they're kind of a subgenre of skirmish games. There's one called Demon Ship specifically that I'm thinking of. And basically it's one dude developed it, some European dude, crazy awesome person. And it comes with terrain that you have to kind of build up. And you have a scenario book, and the scenario book will tell you where to put the terrain, and you put the terrain, and I think it's a 12 by 12 area or something like that. You've got your typical gun-toting person on a spaceship, and aliens are coming after you. And the AI system through dice rolls or through all the mechanics will provide all the reinforcement for the scenario, and then you just make the decisions.
You're just reacting, basically.
And it gained a massive amount of popularity. Another one that we saw yesterday was Last Girl Alive.
Yep.
Same kind of thing. Where is this fall? It's not role play, and it's not really board game anymore because it's pulling all these mechanics from wargaming, right? But it's skirmish wargaming.
I think it's directly related to toxic people, in all honesty. Because you think about how many people are heavy into wargaming and stuff like that, and a lot of those people you don't want to be around.
It's true. Dear listeners, when you're trying to understand what it's like in role-playing games, it's pretty nice because you can sit in on a group and you can usually see a group of people play. If you try to watch what wargaming is it's probably a lot like trying to watch people play Magic the Gathering,
Yeah.
like away from TV.
Yeah.
Or, sorry, away from like the internet.
Because they're not explaining anything.
Yeah.
You're just, things are happening. Dice are getting rolled.
And people don't understand the emotional, weirdly part. So there's a difference between like, I am a problematic person and I am going to make this scenario bad, and you spending, because so much has to come into preparing and finding a place and scheduling time and setting up terrain and putting your army on the field, that all that emotion for the whole week gets put onto something you're doing for like 3 or 4 hours. And then that thing has a lot of sway back and forth. And sometimes, especially when you roll 8 ones, it it erupts, and your normal composure is gone, and you start punching a chair as your two closest friends are just like, "Are you okay, Grey? Do we need to get something for you? I just need dice that don't roll ones every time I need to do something."
Because it always is the dice fault.
Well, yes. Yeah. Thanks. Wonderbar.
But I mean, no, okay. Clarification. Yes, in that particular situation, it 100% was the dice's fault. But there are situations where it's just, you have the person who can't accept that they lost because they lost.
No, absolutely right. And obviously you could go into a lot of different subtopics. But unfortunately, the one true thing for most of these game systems is that because they have to introduce an element of luck, if you have like statistic breaking bad luck, you're in for a bad time, and there's very little you can do about it. And like, we've all had those runs where you're just like, did I run over a witch or something on the way here? Like, what happened?
Shouldn't that be good luck?
Yeah, I know, right? Like, I did the church's work. Come baptize these dice.
Just a master's bidding.
Yeah. But like, yeah, and so like, you have to be an adult, you have to compose yourself, you have to know when to walk away and be like, hey, I'm not going to get a cathartic ending to this scenario, whatever. There's a lot of, as complex as RPGs and coming to the table and telling a story with your friends are, so is coming to the story and playing the story of a battle, and not throwing dice across the room and picking a model up in the middle of some dude's garage somewhere, and like, I concede, like, and
throwing it,
packing all your crap up and leaving. So yeah, wargaming is like, it's a very worthwhile hobby. I do believe it's a little harder to bridge the gender gap.
Yeah,
because there's like a uniquely kind of guy thing, and like a bunch of sweaty guys shooting each other, and
there's the whole issue of any female who is into it has to deal with those hyper non-socialized in many ways people that are involved in it.
Yeah, we Godspeed on that note. Yeah. But yeah, I think it's worthwhile. If you haven't explored, don't go after the big guns yet. Like, there are systems that you can get out to, like a War Machine that we talked about, where you can get in for a much lower price point. You can get a box that has everything you need for you and your buddy to play that, or you and your brother or sister or whatever, and you can play the game. And if you like measuring and like fiddling with tokens and doing this stuff, there's a part of your brain that's just going to go, I have found my new mental crack.
Yep.
And I will want this until the day I'm put into the ground.
And another option that's out there as well, as much as GW doesn't want you to use it, is you don't have to use the models that GW sells to play their game. You can use proxies.
And you don't even have to play their game. Like one-page rules, which is free. Now they're kind of trying to get away from free, which I don't like, but whatever. Like, go play a free game with free stuff and see if you like it. Because we all played Army Men. Everybody got that parent who was like, hey, it's $1.25 for a bunch of plastic.
Yep.
I'm sure you'll play with these. And, it's better when there are dice rolls involved.
And more than likely, that weird guy that doesn't talk to people that you work with probably plays Warhammer. Go see if he's got an extra army.
Dude, oh my God. the amount of people when I let down the blast shield of like, this is one of the things I do, the amount of like normal quote unquote people who like were like, hey, have you talked to the creepy dude over in the back section over there? He does that stuff all the time. And I'm like, fellow, my people, rise up, but don't put your arms too high unless you put on deodorant this morning.
Yes, please make sure you put on deodorant today.
All right. Well, with that,
you just insulted so many people.
Get in the comic. Come after it.
Yeah, do it.
Play more war games, have fun, and try not to punch chairs.
Yeah.